Hi, I'm Marty Nemko. From the many articles on psychologytoday.com, the editors pick a small percentage as what they call essential reads. From the most recent 325 of those essential reads, I've selected excerpts from 12 that I believe are particularly worthy of your attention. And within those, I've made some minor cuts for space, and here they are. First article is called What We Really Know About Mindfulness, and it comes from the Cornell University's Bronfenbrenner Center for the Study of Translational Research. And here's the excerpt. The evidence on meditation is flawed. Researchers don't really know how meditation affects the mind and brain. A new sweeping review makes the case that society's beliefs about mindfulness as a cure-all are misguided. They found the vast majority of evidence available on mindfulness has two main flaws. There is no consistent definition for mindfulness, and researchers don't have a consistent way to measure the results of mindfulness. The next article in the essential reads of the 12 that I've picked out of their among the 325 that Psychology Today picked as essential reads out of their thousands of articles, is called If ADHD Isn't Real, How Come So Many Children Struggle? And the excerpt I chose to focus on were 4 tips for parents of kids seen to be ADHD. 1. Praise your child on their high levels of energy. Remind them of the many situations in which they do well and encourage them to transfer those strengths to other contexts. Use the child's interests as an anchor. The second tip is use peer mentoring to increase pride and confidence. All kids like to be helpful and feel that they can be mentors. We are also much better at helping others than helping ourselves, so peer mentoring makes sense. 3, be consistent in enforcing consequences. Easier said than done. Children who whine, fidget, and fuss do it because they learned it works. Backing down sometimes and being firm in other moments creates confusing expectations and a chaotic regime of emotions for parents and kids that resembles a slot machine addiction. The road may be bumpy in the beginning, but a mere week of full consistency can help correct a bad behavior. 4, can my child go off medication? The decision will ideally be made through a child psychiatrist with expertise in attention disorders and not simply with a general practitioner. The next Essential Reads article I've plucked out for excerpting is entitled Psychology Textbooks Contain Inaccuracies on Intelligence. This is written by Alexander Blum from the Psychology Today editorial staff. Here's the excerpt. Richard Heyer, a professor emeritus of pediatric neurology at the University of California, says, quote, these textbooks just do not give a fair representation of what the data has been showing regarding IQ for the last 30 years. Russell Warren, the Utah Valley University Associate Professor of Psychology and co-author of a new study, found that 23 out of 29 textbooks contained, quote, inaccurate statements, end quote, and 23 included, quote, logical fallacies, end quote, in their content on intelligence. Later on in the article, he says undergraduates might come away with a false sense that the concept of intelligence is based on arbitrarily chosen tasks. Heyer says, quote, there might be 1,000 genes related to intelligence, each one having a tiny effect. That's a lot of genes to manipulate if you want to change intelligence. But it might be that a couple hundred of those genes affect one brain system in different ways, so you might target that brain system to influence intelligence, end quote. The next article I want to highlight here is called A Passionate Call for a Commitment to the Truth by Gina Gorlin. People of all political persuasions seem increasingly willing to uphold their, quote, principles at any price, including the price of bending or disregarding reality. Without a commitment to grounding beliefs in what is true, we lack a fundamental motivation to check and validate, and if need be, abandon or revise whatever principles we happen to ingest from parents, peers, and professors. Make no mistake, this is hard to do. Consider, for example, how much more pleasant it is to lampoon the most ludicrous version of a view you disagree with than it is to find and listen intently to its most compelling advocates. Or how much more comfortable it is to get your news from media outlets that share your ideological leanings than to seek out both sides of every story. For that matter, think of how much easier it is to showcase your in-group loyalty by unquestioningly supporting your party, or showcase your so-called caring for the weak by avoiding words and ideas that might offend someone, than to pursue the facts wherever they lead, even at the risk of disloyalty or hurt feelings. Sit down and make a written inventory of all the feared or suspected truths you tend to avoid. The next step is to examine them honestly and rationally. For each one, ask yourself, is this actually true? That's the end of that excerpt. The next article I plucked from the 325 essential reads that Psychology Today plucked out is called Better to Have Loved and Lost Than Never Loved at All by Bella DiPaolo. If you stay single all your life, are you better off or worse off than if you marry, but then get divorced or become widowed? In my original blog post on this subject, I said that lifelong single people were typically better off than divorced or widowed people in the kinds of ways that researchers typically measure, such as their happiness and health. Most often, the results of the new research underscore the same message, only in a more compelling way. Where the new research becomes even more dramatic is in challenging the long-standing claims that people who marry become happier and healthier, and better off in other ways too. At best, people who marry experience a brief increase in happiness early on, a honeymoon effect, but then go back to being as happy or as unhappy as they were when they were single. But even this honeymoon effect is not enjoyed by everyone who marries, but only by those who marry and stay married. The people who marry and then divorce typically already becoming a bit less happy as the day of their wedding approaches. The results for health are even more shattering of the myths we have grown up with. In some studies, by some measures, people who marry end up less healthy than they were when they were single. Even when studies show an initial improvement for those who marry, the decrease for people who divorce is sometimes much bigger. The next article is called Why Smarter Men Make Better Partners by Susan Kraus-Whitborn. A new study by Jaakko Aspera and colleagues, 2018 study, from the Hanken School of Economics in Finland, suggests that when it comes to picking a male partner, the smarter one is the better bet. The other piece of the puzzle is whether those brighter men find their partners to be scintillating enough to get them through the long haul. Are they able to have intellectually stimulating conversations, particularly after the early flush of romantic attraction passes by? The next article is called Individual Differences, subtitle, These 9 Basic Dimensions Differentiate Us from One Another, by Glenn Geher. These trait dimensions importantly define who we are. Extroversion versus introversion, how outgoing someone is, and how comfortable someone is in social settings. Neuroticism versus emotional stability, that is, how emotionally volatile someone is. Agreeableness versus disagreeableness. Of course, these are continua, not black and white. How easygoing and friendly someone is. Conscientiousness to disorganized. Someone who's highly conscientious is reliable, always makes deadlines and keeps his or her workplace neat. Openness versus closed-mindedness. Someone high in openness is open to new ideas, new people, and new ways of doing things. Narcissism versus selflessness. Someone who's high in narcissism spends a disproportionate amount of time thinking about him or herself. Psychopathy versus empathy. Someone high on psychopathy does not feel for others or care much about their welfare, while someone who's low on that trait cares for others genuinely and feels a great deal for them. Machiavellianism versus scrupulousness. People high on Machiavellianism will only do the right thing by others to the extent it benefits themselves. Someone lower in this dimension has a strong moral compass and will strive to do the right thing regardless of the benefit to oneself. And finally, slow life history strategy versus fast life history strategy. Someone who has a slow life history strategy will take an approach to life that is slow, taking steps to invest much in the future. Someone with a fast life history strategy focuses more on the here and now, as if expecting that life might end at any point. The next article is called Smile, There Is No Hell, Even the Pope Says So, by David Noyes. I may have mispronounced that, I apologize. Controversy erupted this week with reports that Pope Francis denied the existence of hell. Quoted by an Italian journalist who's both a friend and frequent interviewer of the pontiff, Francis reportedly said that sinners who die without eternal salvation, quote, are not punished, end quote, but instead their souls simply disappear. Quote, there is no hell, end quote, he unambiguously declared. Steven Pinker, author of the book Enlightenment Now, attributes today's softening of harsh theology to the influence of Enlightenment humanism. With the rise of reason and science as major forces in the world, unimaginable progress has ensued, and not just technological process, but moral as well. The next article is 5 Ways to Divorce-Proof Your Marriage by James J. Sexton. Be a cheerleader for, these are just 2 tips among the 5 ways I've picked out. Be a cheerleader for your spouse. You are uniquely positioned to be a voice of support and encouragement for your spouse. Resist the temptation to compare your spouse to an imaginary ideal that you've created in your head, or what romance films have told you a, quote, perfect spouse would look and act like. Your partner needs a cheerleader. We all do. And his second tip is, realize that no one can do everything. We've created an insane notion as a culture that if your spouse isn't meeting all your needs in every aspect of life all the time, they're failing at their job as spouse. A spouse who meets many of your needs much of the time is a massive win. The next article is called Too Much Charisma is Bad for Leadership by Art Markman. People moderate in charisma were judged as more effective leaders than people who were very low or very high in charisma. Leaders themselves discount the importance of being operational and overestimate the value of charisma. The next article is called Seeking Justice or Enhancing a Victimized Identity by Greg Enriquez. The public group dynamics are pushing for justification, investment, influence toward women's rights, and the outing of male sexual predation. That is the group force. But when does the group force become groupthink overshoot? And when does it morph into turning women into hypersensitive victims, or becomes an example of virtue signal? The thought that every sophisticated person knows this society is racist and sexist, and to question that at any level is to reveal either ignorance or nefarious defensive motives. Last and perhaps least, the Psychology Today editor selected 2 of my articles as essential reads. Here are excerpts from one of those articles. That's called 10 Tips for Parents of a Smart Child. Do nothing. What? Do nothing? Yes. The good news is that bright and gifted kids left to their own devices usually have the brain power to come up with activities for themselves that are appropriately difficult and of interest at that time. We as parents or even educators are just guessing. So, don't overschedule your child. Allow him or her time to imagine, to create games out of nothing, and yes, use the computer. My next tip is use hoagiesgifted.org. That's Hoagies gifted.org. It offers a wealth of resources, tips for parents, to lesson plans for teachers, to advice for counselors, to schools and summer camps specializing in smart kids. Ask more, tell less. For example, as you're driving, look for opportunities to ask moderately challenging questions. For example, what do you see as the pros and cons of having speed limits? When your child comes home late to dinner, instead of a lecture, you might ask, how do you think we should deal with this? Conversely, encourage your child to ask you and others why questions. Next tip, choose your child's school carefully. Choose a school in which there are lots of smart kids. How to check a school out? Get the principal's permission to walk down the halls and peek into classrooms. Can you see your child fitting in? And also hang out on the playground. Is the peer interaction generally kind? Get a smart caretaker. If you're working full-time, get a smart, kind college student to, for example, pick your child up from school, drive to activities, help with homework, and yes, have fun. Often a college student is happy to share a hobby with your child, whether acting, sports, crafts, whatever. Skip a grade or more? If your child is significantly more academically advanced than the students in his or her grade, consider asking the principal or a counselor about skipping a grade or even more than one grade. The evidence is clear that it can be a big plus. Even if the child's social skills aren't advanced, the benefit often outweighs the liability, especially if the receiving teacher is pleased to accept the child and pairs the child with a bright, popular, kind child in that class. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Marty Nemko.